The life of Lucky the whooping crane actually began thousands of years ago, when whooping cranes occurred throughout much of North America. But when European settlers began to influence the continent, whooping crane numbers began to decline. Their population reached an all-time low of 22 individuals in 1942. At that time, a few dedicated conservationists banded together, referring to themselves as the Hooper Club. The Hooper Club evolved into the Whooping Crane Conservation Association. All along, their goal was to call attention to the serious plight of whooping cranes. They prodded government agencies in the United States and Canada to do more for hoopers. Slowly, their efforts began to pay off. Hunters were taught about the plight of whooping cranes and encouraged to be aware of these great white birds while hunting. Aransas National Wildlife Refuge on the Texas coast, which is the winter home for whooping cranes, received increased protection and management attention. In Canada, special attention was directed to protect Hooper nesting habitat in Wood Buffalo National Park. Slowly, whooping crane numbers increased, and today there are almost 200 in the original wild population. After their numbers in the wild had increased to a safe level, managers began removing some of the eggs from whooping crane nests, hatching them and rearing them in captivity. This was done in an effort to protect the flock from a potential disaster. It was possible that a disaster such as oil spill or hurricane near their Texas winter home could destroy the entire wild population. Finally, when the number of captive birds increased, additional efforts were attempted to start new wild flocks. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, in cooperation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Canadian Wildlife Service, initiated efforts to start a new flock in 1993. Captive reared whooping cranes were released in central Florida in an area known as the Kissimmee Prairie. The successful release and survival of hoopers was trying because the birds had to learn how to cope in the wild. They had to learn what to eat, how to avoid the numerous predators, including bobcats and alligators. Fortunately, this part of Florida has a healthy population of non-migratory sandhill cranes, and over several years the released whooping cranes learned what they needed to know to survive from the sandhill cranes. 2 of these surviving whooping cranes would become Lucky's parents. Here is how whooping cranes have been reintroduced into Florida. Whooping cranes are fed and trained by people in costume. This helps to prevent the cranes from becoming accustomed to humans. The cranes will become wilder sooner if they are suspicious of people and learn to keep their distance. We try to minimize human contact with young birds as much as possible. We constructed a large predator-proof pen in the wetland habitat where the whooping cranes will be introduced. The pens are fabricated of reusable material to provide the adequate protection while the young birds are in the pens. The young whooping cranes will live in these pens for several weeks while they begin to adjust to life in the wild. The pens allow the young bird's security to grow stronger and begin adjusting to their new environment. Then the pens are taken down to be used again next year. Whooping cranes are delivered to the field by airplane and truck. Project personnel must handle the cranes carefully to prevent injuries, and we must remain alert to keep from being injured ourselves by the birds. When the hoopers are unloaded, each one is weighed and given a thorough physical examination by the project veterinarian. Then we place a combination of bands on their legs to uniquely mark each individual bird. After the exams, the whooping cranes are released into their predator-proof soft-release pens, where they can safely acclimate to their new wild surroundings. They learn much during this time by observing their environment and by foraging on wild foods in the pen. Then, when they are ready, we remove their flight restraints so they can fly out of the pen when they want to. Eventually, the hoopers leave the protection of the pen. Food is provided outside the pen by automatic feeders. In time, they will learn to feed entirely on natural foods. Each bird has a radio transmitter attached to one of the leg bands. The transmitter sends a signal that we can receive with ground-based receiving equipment or from airplanes. This helps to keep up with each of the released whooping cranes. The airplanes are necessary for tracking the whooping cranes once they disperse from the release area. They travel over a large part of the Central Florida prairie habitat where whooping cranes now live. Sometimes we must recapture a whooping crane after it has been released. We may need to replace a failed transmitter or check on some health problem. This is how we recapture them. Finally, the survivors began to nest and hatch their young. On March 12th and 14th of 2002, 2 chicks were hatched in one nest. A bald eagle caught one of them when it was just a few hours old. Because of his narrow escape and survival, the remaining young chick was named Lucky. Later, when the eagles returned to the area where their parents were raising Lucky, the parents attacked and mauled the eagle. The injured eagle had to be sent to a rehabilitation facility to recover. Lucky is the first whooping crane chick to hatch and fledge in the wild in the United States since the last nesting of hoopers in Louisiana in 1939.